Chapter 37. Traveling was even worse than Roscoe had supposed it would be, and he had supposed it would be pure hell. Before he had gone from Fort Smith much more than 3 hours, he had the bad luck to run into a bunch of wild pigs. For some reason, Memphis, his mount, had an unreasoning fear of pigs, and this particular bunch of pigs had a strong dislike of white horses, or perhaps of deputy sheriffs. Before Roscoe had much more than noticed the pigs, he was in a runaway. Fortunately, the pines were not too thick, or Roscoe felt he would not have survived. The pigs were led by a big brown boar that was swifter than most pigs. The boar was nearly on them before Memphis got his speed up. Roscoe yanked out his pistol and shot at the boar till the pistol was empty, but he missed every time, and when he tried to reload, racing through the trees with a lot of pigs after him, he just dropped the bullets. He had a rifle, but was afraid to get out for fear he'd drop that too. Fortunately, the pigs weren't very determined. They soon stopped, but Memphis couldn't be slowed until he'd run himself out. After that, he was worthless for the rest of the day. In the afternoon, stopping to drink at a little creek, he bogged to his knees. Roscoe had to get off and whip him on the butt 5 or 6 times with a lariat rope before he managed to lunge out of the mud, by which time Roscoe himself was covered with it. He also lost one boot, sucked so far down in the mud he could barely reach it. He hadn't brought an extra pair of boots, mainly because he didn't own one, and was forced to waste most of the afternoon trying to clean the mud off the ones he had. He made his first camp barely 10 miles from town. What mostly worried him wasn't that he was too close to the town, but that he was too close to the pigs. For all he knew, the pigs were still tracking him. The thought that they might arrive just after he went to sleep kept him from getting to sleep until almost morning. Roscoe was a town man and had spent little time sleeping in the woods. He slept blissfully on the old settee in the jail because there you didn't have to worry about snakes, wild pigs, Indians, bandits, bears, or other threats, just the occasional rowdy prisoner who could be ignored. Once the night got late, the woods were as noisy as a saloon, only Roscoe didn't know what most of the noises meant. To him they meant threats. He sat with his back to a tree all night, his pistol in his hand, his rifle across his lap. Finally, about the time it grew light, he got too tired to care if bears or pigs ate him, and he stretched out for a little while. The next day he felt so tired he could barely stay in the saddle, and Memphis was almost as tired. The excitement of the first day had left them both worn out. Neither had much interest in their surroundings, and Roscoe had no sense at all that he was getting any closer to catching up with July. Fortunately, there was a well-marked army trail between Fort Smith and Texas, and he and Memphis plodded along it all day, stopping frequently to rest. Then, as the sun was falling, he had what seemed like a stroke of luck. He heard someone yelling, and he rode into a little clearing near the trail, only to discover that the reason there was a clearing was that the farmer had cut down the trees. Now the man was trying to get the clearing even clearer by pulling up stumps using a team of mules for the purpose. The mules were tugging and pulling at a big stump, with the farmer yelling at them to pull harder. Roscoe had little interest in the work, but he did have an interest in the presence of the farmer, which must mean that a cabin was somewhere near. Maybe he could sleep with a roof over his head for one more night. He rode over and stopped a respectful distance away, so as not to frighten the mule team. The stump was only partly out. Quite a few of its thick roots were still running into the ground. At that point, the farmer, who was wearing a floppy hat, happened to notice Roscoe. Immediately the action stopped as the farmer looked him over. Roscoe rode a little closer, meaning to introduce himself, when to his great surprise the farmer took off his hat and turned out not to be a he. Instead, the fanner was a good-sized woman wearing man's clothes. She had brown hair and had sweated through her shirt. "Well, you gonna get off and help, or are you just gonna sit there looking dumb?" she asked, wiping her forehead. "I'm a deputy sheriff," Roscoe replied, thinking that would be all the explanation that was needed. "Then take off your star, if that's heavy," the woman said. "Help me cut these roots. I'd like to get this stump out before dark. Otherwise, we'll have to work at it all night, and I hate to waste the coal." Roscoe hardly knew what to think. He'd never tried to pull a stump in his life and didn't want to start. On the other hand, he didn't want to sleep in the woods another night if he could help it. The woman was looking Memphis over while she caught her breath. "We might could hitch that horse to a team," she said. "My mules ain't particular." "Why, this horse wouldn't know what to do if it was hitched," Roscoe said. "It's a riding horse." "Oh, I see," the woman said. You mean it's dumb or too lazy to work." It seemed the world was full of outspoken women. The woman farmer reminded Roscoe a little of Peach. Somewhat reluctantly, he got down, tied Memphis to a bush at the edge of the field. The woman was waiting impatiently. She handed Roscoe an axe, and he began to cut the thick, tough roots while the woman encouraged the team. The stump edged out of the ground a little farther, but it didn't come loose. Roscoe hadn't handled an axe much in the last few years and was awkward with it. Cutting roots was not like cutting firewood. The roots were so tough the axe tended to bounce unless the hit was perfect. Once he hit a root too close to the stump, and the axe bounced out of his hand and nearly hit the woman on the foot. "Dern! I never meant to let it get loose from me," Roscoe said. The woman looked disgusted. "If I had a piece of rawhide, I'd tie it to your hand," she said. "Then the two of you could flop around all you wanted to. What town hired you to be deputy sheriff, anyway?" "Why, Fort Smith," Roscoe said. "July Johnson's the sheriff." "I wish he'd been the one who showed up," the woman said. "Maybe he'd know how to chop a root." Then she began to pop the mules again, and Roscoe continued to whack at the roots, squeezing the axe tightly so it wouldn't slip loose again. In no time he was sweating worse than the woman, sweat dripping into his eyes and off his nose. It had been years since he had sweated so much, and he didn't enjoy the sensation. While he was half blinded by the sweat, the mules gave a big pull. One of the roots that he'd been able to cut suddenly slipped out of the ground, uncurled, and lashed at him like a snake. The root hit him just above the knees and knocked him backwards, causing him to drop the axe again. He tried to regain his balance, but lost it and fell flat on his back. The root was still twitching and curling as if it had a life of its own. The woman didn't even look around. The mules had the stump moving, and she kept at them, popping them with the reins and yelling at them as if they were deaf. Well, Roscoe lay there and watched the big stump slowly come out of the hole where it had been for so many years. A couple of small roots still held, but the mules kept going, and the stump was soon free. Roscoe got slowly to his feet, only to realize that he could barely walk. The woman seemed to derive a certain amusement from the way he hobbled around, trying to gain control of his limbs. "Who'd they send you off to catch?" she asked. "Or did they just decide you wasn't worth your salary and run you out of town?" Roscoe felt aggrieved. Even strangers didn't seem to think he was worth his salary, and yet in his view he did a fine job of keeping the jail. "I'm after July Johnson," he said. "His wife run off." "I wish he'd run this way," the woman said. "I'd put her to work helping me clear this field. It's slow work doing it alone." And yet the woman had made progress. At the south edge of the field where Memphis was tied, 40 or 50 stumps were lined up. "Where's your men folks?" Roscoe asked. "Dead or gone," the woman said. "I can't find no husband that knows how to stay alive. My boys didn't care for work, so they left about the time of the war and didn't come back." "What's your name, deputy?" "Roscoe Brown," Roscoe said. "I'm Louisa," the woman said. "Louisa Brooks. I was born in Alabama, and I wished I'd stayed. Got 2 husbands buried there, and there's another buried on this property here, right back of the house. He's buried, that was Jim," she added. "He was fat, and I couldn't get him in the wagon, so I dug the hole, and there he lies." "Well, that's a shame," Roscoe said. "No, we didn't get on," Louisa said. "He drank whiskey and talked the Bible, too, and I like a man that does one thing or the other. I told him once he could fall dead for all I care, and it wasn't 3 weeks before the fool just did it." Though Roscoe had been hopeful of staying the night, he was beginning to lose his inclination. Louisa Brooks was almost as scary as wild pigs in his view. The mules dragged the stump over to where the others were, and Roscoe walked over and helped Louisa untie it. "Roscoe, you're invited to supper," she said, before he could make up his mind to go. "I bet you can eat better than you can chop." "Oh, I ought to get after July," Roscoe said half-heartedly. "His wife run off." "I meant to run off before Jim went and died," Louisa said. "If I had, I wouldn't have had to bury him. Jim was fat. I had to hitch a mule to him to drag him out of the house. Spent all day pulling up stumps and then had to work half the night planting a husband." "How old are you getting to be?" "Why, 48, I guess," Roscoe said, surprised to be asked. Louisa took off her hat and fanned herself with it as they followed the mules down one edge of the field. Roscoe led his horse. "The skinny ones last longer than the fat ones," Louisa said. "You'll probably last till you're about 60. "Or longer, I hope," Roscoe said. "Can you cook?" Louisa asked. She was a fair-looking woman, though large. "No," Roscoe admitted. "I generally eat at the saloon or else go home with July." I can't neither, Louisa said. Never interested me. What I like is farming. I'd farm day and night if it didn't take so much coal oil. That seemed curious. Roscoe had never heard of a woman farmer, though plenty of black women picked cotton during the season. They came to a good-sized clearing without a stump in it. There was a large cabin and a rail corral. Louisa unharnessed the mules and put them in the pen. I'd lead 'em out, but they'd run off, she said. They don't like farming as much as I do. I guess we'll have cornbread for supper. It's about all I eat. Why not bacon? Roscoe asked. He was quite hungry and would have appreciated a good hunk of bacon or a chop of some kind. Several chickens were scratching around the cabin. Any one of them would have made good eating, but he didn't feel he ought to mention it since he was the guest. I won't have no pigs around, Louisa said. Too smart. I won't bother with animals I have to outwit. I'd rather just farm. True to her word, Louisa served up a meal of cornbread washed down with well water. The cabin was roomy and clean, but there was not much food in it. Roscoe was puzzled as to how Louisa could keep going with nothing but cornbread in her. It occurred to him that he'd not seen a milk cow anywhere, so evidently she even dispensed with such amenities as milk and butter. She herself munched a plate of cornbread contentedly, now and then fanning herself. It was hot and still in the cabin. I doubt you'll catch that sheriff, she said, looking Roscoe over. Roscoe doubted it too, but felt he had to make a show of trying at least. What was more likely was that if he rode around long enough, July would eventually come to find him. Well, he went on to Texas, he said. Maybe I'll strike someone that's seen him. Yes, and maybe you'll ride right into a big mess of Comanche Indians, Louisa said. You do that and you'll never enjoy another good plate of cornbread. Roscoe let the remark pass. The less said about Indians, the better, in his view. He munched cornbread for a while, preferring not to think about any various things that might happen to him in Texas. Was you ever married? Louisa asked. No, ma'am, Roscoe said. I was never even engaged. In other words, you've went to waste, Louisa said. Well, I've been a deputy sheriff for a good spell, Roscoe said. I keep the jail. Louisa was watching him closely in a way that made him a little uncomfortable. The only light in the cabin came from a small coal oil lamp on the table. A few small bugs buzzed around the lamp, their movements casting shadows on the table. The cornbread was so dry that Roscoe kept having to dip dipperfuls of water to wash it down. Roscoe, you were in the wrong trade, Louisa said. If you could just learn to handle an axe, you might make a good farmer. Roscoe didn't know what to say to that. Nothing was less likely than he would make a farmer. Why'd that sheriff's wife run off? Louisa asked. She didn't say, Roscoe said. Maybe she said to July, but I doubt it since he left before she did. Didn't like Arkansas, I guess, Louisa said. You might just as well let her go if that's the case. I like it myself, though it ain't no Alabama. After that, the conversation lagged. Roscoe kept wishing there was something to eat besides cornbread, but there wasn't. Louisa continued to watch him from the other side of the table. Roscoe, have you had any experience with women at all? She asked after a bit. To Roscoe, it seemed a bold question, and he took his time answering it. Once, about 20 years earlier, he had fancied a girl named Betsy and had been thinking about asking her to take a walk with him some night. But he was shy, and while he was getting around to asking, Betsy died of smallpox. He'd always regretted that they never got to take their walk, but after that, he hadn't tried to have much to do with women. Well, not much, he admitted finally. I got the solution to both our problems, Louisa said. You let that sheriff find his own wife and stay here and we'll get married. She said it in the same confident, slightly loud voice that she had always used. Seemed after a day yelling at mules, it was probably hard to speak in a quiet voice. Despite the loudness, Roscoe assumed he had misunderstood her. A woman didn't just come out and ask a man to marry. He pondered what she had said a minute, trying to figure out where he might have missed her meaning. It stumped him, though, so he chewed slowly on his last bite of cornbread. What was it you said? He asked finally. I said we ought to get married, Louisa said loudly. What I like about you is you're quiet. Jim talked every second that he didn't have a whiskey bottle in his mouth. I got tired of listening. Also, you're skinny. If you don't last, you'll be easy to bury. I've buried enough husbands to take such things into account. What do you say? Well, I don't want to, Roscoe said. He was aware that it sounded impolite, but was too startled to say otherwise. Well, you ain't had time to think about it, Louisa said. Give it some thought while you're finishing the cornbread. Much as I hate burying husbands, I don't want to live alone. Jim wasn't much good, but he was somebody in the bed at least. I've had 6 boys in all, but not one of them stayed around. Had 2 girls, but they both died. That's 8 children. I always meant to have 10, but I've got 2 to go and time's running out. She munched her cornbread for a while. She seemed to be amused, though Roscoe couldn't figure out what might be amusing. How big was your family? She asked. There's just 4 of us boys, Roscoe said. Ma died young. Louisa was watching him, which made him nervous. He remembered that he was supposed to be thinking about the prospect of marrying her while he finished the cornbread, but in fact his appetite was about gone away and was having to choke it down. He began to feel more and more of a grievance against more and more people. The start of it all was Jake Spoon, who had no business coming to Fort Smith in the first place. It seemed to him that the chain of thoughtlessness actions on the part of many people he knew had resulted in his being stuck in a cabin in the wilderness with a difficult widow woman. Jake should have kept his pistol handier and not resorted to a buffalo gun. Benny Johnson should have been paying attention to his dentistry and not walking around the street in the middle of the day. July shouldn't have married Elmira if she was going to run off, and of course Elmira certainly had no business getting on the whiskey boat. In all of it, no one had given much consideration to him, least of all the townspeople of Fort Smith. Peach Johnson and Charlie Barnes, in particular, had done their best to see that he had to leave. But if the townspeople of Fort Smith had not considered him, the same couldn't be said for Louisa Brooks, who was giving him a good deal more consideration than he was accustomed to. I was never a big meat eater, she said. Living off cornbread keeps you feeling light on your feet. Roscoe didn't feel light on his feet, though. Both his legs pained him from where the root had struck them. He choked down the last of the cornbread and took another swallow or two of the cool well water. You ain't a bad-looking fellow, Louisa said. Jim was prone to warts. Had 'em on his hands and on his neck, both. So far as I can see, you don't have a wart on you. No, don't believe so, Roscoe admitted. Well, that's all the supper, Louisa said. What about my proposition? I can't, Roscoe said, putting it as politely as he knew how. If I don't keep on till I find July, I might lose my job. Louisa looked exasperated. You're a fine guest, she said. I'll tell you what, let's give it a tryout. You ain't had enough experience of women to know whether you like the married life or not. It might suit you to a T. If it did, you wouldn't have to do risky work like being a deputy. It was true that being a deputy had become almost intolerably risky. Roscoe had to grant that. But judging from July's experience, marriage had its risks too. I don't favor mustaches much, Louisa said, but then life's a matter of give and take. They had eaten the cornbread right out of the pan, so there were no dishes to wash. Louisa got up and threw a few crumbs out the door to her chickens, who rushed at them greedily, 2 of them coming right into the cabin. Don't you eat them chickens? Roscoe asked, thinking how much better the cornbread would have tasted if there had been a chicken to go with it. No, I just keep 'em to control the bugs, Louisa said. I ate enough chicken in Alabama to last me a lifetime. Roscoe felt plenty nervous. The question of sleeping arrangements could not be postponed much longer. He had looked forward briefly to sleeping in the cabin where he would feel secure from snakes and wild pigs, but that hope was dashed. He hadn't spent a night alone with a woman in his whole life and didn't plan to start with Louisa, who stood in the doorway drinking a dipper of water. She squished a swallow or 2 around in her mouth and spat it out the door. Then she put the dipper back in the bucket and leaned over to Roscoe so close he nearly tipped over backward in his chair out of surprise. Roscoe, you've went to waste long enough, she said. Let's give it a try. Well, I wouldn't know how to try, Roscoe said. I've been a bachelor all my life. Louisa straightened up. Men are about as worthless a race of people as I've ever encountered, she said. Look at the situation a minute. You're running off to catch a sheriff you probably can't find who's in the most dangerous state in the Union. And if you do find him, he'll just go off and try to find a wife that don't want to live with him anyway. You'll probably get scalped before it's all over, or hung, or a Mexican will get you with a pig sticker. And it'll all be to try and mend something that won't mend anyway. Now, I own a section of land here, and I'm a healthy woman. I'm willing to take you, although you've got no experience either at farming or matrimony. You'd be useful to me, whereas you won't be a bit of use to that sheriff or that town you work for either. I'll teach you how to handle an axe and a mule team and guarantee you'll the cornbread you can eat. We might even have some peas to go with it later in the year. I can cook peas. Plus, I've got one of the few feather mattresses in this part of the country, so it'd be easy sleeping. And now you're scared to try? If that ain't cowardice, I don't know what is." Roscoe had never expected to hear such a speech and had no idea how to reply to it. Louisa's approach to marriage didn't seem to resemble any that he had ever observed, though it was true he had not spent much time studying the approaches to matrimony. Still, he had only ridden into Louisa's field an hour before sundown, and it was not yet much more than an hour after dark. Her proposal seemed hasty to him by any standards. "Well, we ain't much acquainted," he said. "How do you know we'd get along?" "I don't," Louisa said. "That's why I offered just to give it a tryout. If you don't like it, you can leave, and if I can't put up with you, I expect I could soon run you off. But you ain't even got the gumption to try. I'd say you're scared of women." Roscoe had to admit that was true, except for a whore now and then. But he only admitted it to himself, not to Louisa. After some reflection, he decided it was best to leave her charge unanswered. "I guess I'll bed down out back," he said. "Well, fine," Louisa said. "Just watch out for Ed." That was a surprise. "Who's Ed?" he asked. "Ed's a snake," Louisa said. "Big rattler. I named him after my uncle because they're both lazy. I let Ed stay around because he holds down the rodents. He don't bother me and I don't bother him, but he hangs out around the back, so watch out where you throw your blanket." Roscoe did watch. He stepped so gingerly getting his bedding arranged that it took him nearly 20 minutes to settle down. Then he couldn't get the thought of the big snake out of his mind. He had never heard of anyone naming a snake before, but then nothing she did accorded with any procedure he was familiar with. The fact that she had mentioned the snake meant that he had little chance of getting to sleep. He had heard that snakes had a habit of crawling in with people, and he definitely didn't want to be crawled in with. He wrapped his blanket around him tightly to prevent Ed from slipping in, but it was hot, sultry night. He was soon sweating so profusely that he couldn't sleep anyway. There were plenty of grass and weeds around, and every time anything moved in the grass, he imagined it was the big rattler. Snake might get along with Louisa, but that didn't mean he would accept strangers. Hours passed, and he still couldn't get to sleep, though he was plenty tired. It was clear that if the sleeping didn't improve, he was going to be dead on his feet long before he got back to Fort Smith. His eyelids would fall, but then he'd hear something jerk awake, a process that went on until he was too tired to care whether he died or not. He'd been propped up against the wall of the cabin, but he slowly slid down and finally slept flat on his back. When he awoke, he got a shock almost worse than if he had found the rattler curled on his chest. Louisa was standing astraddle of him. Roscoe was so tired that it was only his brain that had come awake, it seemed. He would ordinarily have reacted quickly to the sight of anyone standing astraddle of him, much less a woman, but in this case his limbs were so heavy with sleep that he couldn't move a one. Opening his eyes was an effort enough. It was nearly sun up, but sultry and humid. He saw that Louisa was barefoot and that her feet and ankles were wet from the dewy grass. He couldn't see her face or judge her disposition, but he felt a longing to be back on his couch in the jail where crazy things didn't happen. Although he was just in his long johns, the blanket was up to his chest, so at least she hadn't caught him indecent. For a second, he took a sleepy comfort from that reflection, but a second later, it ceased to be true. Louisa stuck one of her wet feet under the blanket and kicked it off. Roscoe was so anchored in sleep, he still couldn't react. Then, to his extreme astonishment, Louisa squatted right atop his middle and reached into his long johns and took hold of his tool. Nothing like that had ever happened to him, and he was stunned, though his tool wasn't. While the rest of him had been heavy with sleep, it had become heavy with itself. "Why, you're a torn turkey, ain't you?" Louisa said. To Roscoe's astonishment, Louisa proceeded to squat right down on him. Instead of being covered with a blanket, he was covered with her skirts. At that point, the sun broke through the mist, lighting the clearing and adding to his embarrassment, for anyone could have ridden up and seen that something mighty improper was happening. As it was, though, only 3 or 4 of Louisa's chickens watched the act, but even the fact that the chickens were standing around added to Roscoe's embarrassment. Maybe the chickens weren't really watching, but they seemed to be. Meanwhile, Louisa was wiggling around without much interest in what he thought about it at all. Roscoe decided the best approach was to pretend a dream was happening, though he knew quite well it wasn't. But Louisa's vigor was such that even if Roscoe had gotten his thoughts in place, they would have soon been jarred awry. A time or two he was practically lifted off the ground by her efforts. He was scooted off his tarp and back into the weeds and was forced to open his eyes again in hopes of being able to spot a bush he could grab onto to hold himself in place. About the time Louisa moved him completely off the tarp, matters came to a head. Despite the chickens and the weeds and the danger of witness, he felt a sharp pleasure. Louisa apparently did too, soon afterward, for she wiggled even more vigorously than grunted loudly. Then she sat on him for several minutes, scratching at the chigger bites on his wet ankles. He soon sank right out of her, but Louisa was in no hurry to get up. She seemed in a quiet humor. Once in a while she clucked a time or two at the chickens. Roscoe felt his neck begin to itch from the weeds. A swarm of gnats hung right over his face, and Louisa considerately swatted them away. "There's Ed," Louisa said. Sure enough, a big rattler was crawling over a log about 10 yards away, and Louisa continued to sit, unconcerned about the snake or anything else. "Are you a one-timer or are you a feisty, Roscoe?" she asked after a while. Roscoe had a notion that he knew what she meant. "I'm mostly a no-timer," he said. Louisa sighed. "You ain't hopeless, but you sure ain't feisty," she said after a while, wiping the sweat off her face with the sleeve of her dress. "Let's go see if the cornbread's done." She got up and went back around the house, and Roscoe quickly got dressed and drug his gear around the corner, dumping it in a heap beside the door. When he went in, Louisa sat another pan of cornbread on the table, and they had breakfast. "Well, what's it going to be, marriage or Texas?" Louisa asked after a while. Roscoe knew it had to be Texas, but it was not so simple a matter to think out as it had been before Louisa came out and sat down on him. For one thing, he had no desire to go to Texas. He felt his chances of finding July to be very slim, and July's find in Elmira completely hopeless. In the meantime, it had come clear to him that Louisa had her charms, and that the fact that they were being offered him on a trial basis was a considerable enticement. He was beginning to feel that Louisa was right. He had mostly been wasted, and might have had more feistiness in him than anyone, himself included, had suspected. There was no likelihood of his getting to use much of this capacity in Texas either. "It's a hard choice," he said, though one thing that made it a little easier was the knowledge that life with Louisa involved more than feather beds. It also involved pulling up stumps all day, an activity he had no interest in or aptitude for. "Well, I don't take back nothing I said," Louisa declared. "You men are worthless race. You're good for a bounce now and then, and that's about it. I doubt you make much of a fanner." For some reason, Roscoe felt melancholy. For all her loud talk, Louisa didn't seem to be as disagreeable to him as he had first thought her to be. It seemed to him she might be persuaded to tone down her farming, maybe even move into a town and settle for putting in a big garden if it was presented to her right. But he couldn't, because there was the problem of July, who had given him a job and been good to him. The point was, he owed July. Even if he never found him, he had to make the effort or know that he had failed a friend. Had it not been for that obligation, he would have stayed a day or two and considered Louisa's offer. "It ain't that I ain't obliged," he said. I'm obliged. The darn thing about it is July. Even if Elmira ain't coming back, he's got to be told. It's my darn job to. July's the only friend I got in that town, except Joe. Joe's Elmira's boy." Then a happy thought occurred to him. Maybe July had made a slow start. He might not be too far ahead. Perhaps his jaundice had come back on him, in which case he might have had to hole up for a few days. If he himself was lucky, he might strike July in a week or two and break the news. Once that was done, his obligation would be satisfied, and there would be nothing to keep him from coming back for another visit with Louisa, provided he could find the farm a second time. "I could come back on my way back," he said. "July's been sick. He may have had to hole up. I might have to look no more than a month." Louisa shrugged. "Suit yourself, but don't expect me to hold you no stall," she said. "Somebody feistier than you might ride in tomorrow for all I know." Roscoe found nothing to say. Obviously, he was taking a risk. "What's the story on this July?" Louisa asked. "That wife of his sounds like a woman of ill fame. What kind of sheriff would marry a woman of ill fame?" "Well, July's slow," Roscoe said. "He's the sort that don't talk much." "Oh, that sort," Louisa said. "The opposite of my late husband, Jim." She took a pair of men's brogans from beside the table and began to lace them on her bare feet. "The thing about men that don't talk much is they don't usually learn much either," Louisa said. She got her sunbonnet off a nail on the wall and tucked her thick brown hair under it. "You don't blabber, but I believe you've got it in you to learn," she said. "I'm going to do some farming." "What do I owe you for the grub?" Roscoe asked. "I'd hate to think I'd charge for cornbread," Louisa said. They went out, and Roscoe began to roll up his bedroll. He was preoccupied and made such a sloppy job of it that Louisa burst out laughing. She had a happy laugh. One corner of his tarp hung down over the horse's flank. "Roscoe, you're a disgrace in most respects," Louisa said. "I bet you lose that bedroll before you get to Texas." "Well, should I stop back?" Roscoe asked, for she seemed in a fair humor. "Why, I guess so," Louisa said. "I've put up with worse than you and probably will again." Roscoe rode off, though Memphis didn't take kindly to having the tarp flopping at his flank, so he had to get down and retie the roll. When he finally got it tied and remounted to ride on, he saw that Louisa had already hitched her mules to a stump and was giving them loud encouragement as they strained at the harness. It seemed to him he had never met such a curious woman. He gave her a wave that she didn't see and rode on west with very mixed feelings. One moment he felt rather pleased and rode light in the saddle, but the next moment the light feeling would turn heavy. A time or two Roscoe could barely hold back the tears, he felt so sad of a sudden, and it would have been hard to say whether the sadness came because of having to leave Louisa or because of the uncertain journey that lay ahead.